So this is a talk on the intersection between the epistemology of modality and the metaphysics of modality. So it's about how the question of how we get to know what is possible and what is necessary relates to the question of what it is for something to be possible or necessary. I think that these two answers should be in some way harmonized. And so I'm gonna, what I will do is to offer you a picture that I like very much. So I will sketch you an epistemology of modality that I find very appealing, and then a metaphysics of modality that I find very appealing, and sort of paint you a very rose-tinted picture of why that solves all the problems in the world. But then suddenly, since I'm self-sabotaging and I cannot be happy, I will present some troubles with this picture, and I will argue that it's probably not going to work as it is. And then I'll run through a couple of ways to fix it, which I don't find very convincing. So I would greatly appreciate it. And this result makes me very sad, right? It's not what I wanted. And so I'd greatly appreciate it if you've found, if you had any useful suggestions or sort of found a way to fix this. Okay, onto it. Before we start, this is a paper that I've not been working on alone. I've worked on it with Tom Skoonen, now at Freie. And so all the mistakes are his fault, yada, yada, yada. All right, so the plan, I've already sketched it. I will start by laying down an epistemology of modality that I find quite appealing. So obviously, taking in both the epistemology of modality and the metaphysics of modality are huge topics, so I will not be able at all to be systematic or exhaustive about this. And so we'll just start offering you some desiderata that I think that any epistemology of modality should have. And I'm not going to discuss why I go for any of those desiderata, but I'd be very happy to talk about them in the Q&A. Right. So if you're not convinced by one of those, I'd love to get more in detail about those. So the first desiderata that I think any epistemology of modality should have is that it ought to be compatible with a realist view of modality. And by the way, when I talk about modality here, I mean metaphysical modality or natural modality, taken as sort of broad, metaphysical modality, I like to think of it as the broadest kind of alethic modality. If there are some people who are not very happy who think that my metaphysics of modality, the one that I will propose in a second, doesn't quite work to cover the metaphysical modality. And so in answer to them, I'd be perfectly happy to just limit all the claims to kind of natural or physical modality. All the problems emerge the same and all the interesting bits hold the same. Okay, so realism about modality is just the idea that our epistemology should be such that it allows us to describe mind-independent facts, and it doesn't force us to believe that modality is something that we construct as a product of our language, of our way of thinking, so on and so forth. I think this is fairly orthodox as a position. Pretty much everybody, at least in metaphysics and epistemology of modality, like realism, but lately it has been contested a bit more. And so I would have to justify it a bit more. In particular, Emmy Thomason has made some interesting critiques of this project. But for our purposes, I would like our epistemology of modality to be able to describe the modal facts that are out there, largely independent of us. Second desideratum is that I think that any epistemology of modality worth their salt should rule out an extreme kind of modal skepticism. That is, it should be able to vindicate the idea that we have at least some modal knowledge. We might not know everything about the modal facts, but there are some things that I think, especially mundane facts about our lives, that I think we have a good claim to knowledge. For instance, I think I know that if I had left my house 2 minutes earlier today, I would have caught the train and thus avoided rush hour, or that if I dropped this mug on the floor, it would break. Those kind of everyday mundane modal facts, I think any epistemology of modality should be able to account for, at least largely vindicate. If we end up having to postulate that we don't even know those basic things, I think we're a bit in trouble. And this leaves me completely neutral about whether our epistemology of modality should also be able to vindicate the sort of more recherche, more sophisticated question about modality that philosophers like to ask themselves. So Is it possible that there were nothing rather than something? Is time travel possible? Yada, yada, yada. I'm happy that if our theory doesn't necessarily deliver us an easy answer to those, right? But what I want to retain is this sort of form of moderate anti-skepticism, to use Van Inwagen expression. The third desideratum is anti-exceptionalism, which has become very popular after this guy here made a very good point for it in his 2007, The Philosophy of Philosophy. Anti-exceptionalism is the view that a plausible, non-skeptical epistemology of metaphysical modality should subsume our capacity to discriminate metaphysical possibilities from metaphysical impossibilities under more general cognitive capacities used in ordinary life. This is basically to say that it's not fair game to invoke some mysterious separate faculty that only would help us to discriminate modal facts from the others. The way in which we acquire modal knowledge should be in some way continuous to the way in which we acquire knowledge about everything else, right? We shouldn't be invoking other cognitive capacities or other abilities that we normally wouldn't have, right? We don't want to make modality to be magical that way. Now, the issue with anti-exceptionalism is that it risks to be a bit of an empty desideratum, in the sense that obviously what counts as an general cognitive capacity used in ordinary life is a bit up for grabs, right? And so we get various modal epistemologists proposing that imaginability is a good source of knowledge for modality, or ideal positive primary conceivability, and all sorts of things. People also talk about rational intuitions or modal insight, and at least philosophers seem to be using a lot of rational intuitions normally, so why not for modality? And so the risk of invoking anti-exceptionalism as desideratum is that we risk to bog ourselves down in a lot of petty squabbles about what counts as an ordinary capacity or not, right? Is modal insight part of our day-to-day modal toolkit? Maybe, maybe not. I would like to avoid all this discussion. They're very fascinating and these are all interesting, but for our purposes, I would like to try to steer clear of all this discussion. And so I'll make a modest yet ambitious proposal to how to cash out anti-exceptionalism, to quote Weber. That is to adopt as what counts as an ordinary cognitive capacity only something that is absolutely uncontroversial, something that pretty much everybody would concede that we use, that is within our regular cognitive toolkit, right? Something that is beyond discussion. If we manage to get a good epistemology of modality from here, from this source only, then all good. Otherwise, we'll have to enter into the arena and sort of decide whether conceivability is a fine instrument or not. And in particular, there is, I think, one cognitive capacity that it would be fantastic if we could base our epistemology of modality on. And this is perception, because there are no doubts, I think, that perception is a mechanism that we use in our everyday interaction with the world to acquire knowledge about our environment. And also, it's reliable enough. We think that it's in fairly okay-ish epistemic standards. Obviously, it gives us the feasible evidence, but for most part, it sort of does its job, right? And so what I would like to propose is that we try to gun for an epistemology of modality that is at least based on perception or starts from perception, or the perception of modal facts. Another benefit of this approach, which I didn't put into the desiderata because, well, Tom forced me to be a bit more cautious, but which I really like, and I think it's a nice perk, is that basing our epistemology of modality upon perception allow us to retain the causal contact necessary condition on knowledge. This is fairly popular among old-styley solution to get a problem, the idea that, well, it seems very important that the way in which we acquire belief and the content of the belief are causally connected in the right way. And clearly perception gives us such a causal connection, right? If I come to believe that there is a mug in front of me via perception, then I also had some causal contact with the content of my perception, namely with the mug, right? I'm not by any means the first one to suggest that perception could be a good way in. for our knowledge of what is possible and when it's necessary. Recently, Legg and Franklin have had a super interesting paper where they argue that we can perceive mathematical necessity by looking at graphs. But what I'm particularly interested in are the approaches that Margot Strominger and Ben Snane have had over the last few years, where they argue about how we can perceive non-actual possibilities, so mere possibilities. And Barbara Fetter has also started to work in this direction. And this is the route that I will try to pursue here today. How does that work? Well, the key ingredient of the approach is to invoke affordances, in the sense that J.J. Gibson, in the context of ecological theories of perception and psychology, invoked. Affordances are basically perceptions of things that inform us not only of how things are, but also most of the time what we could do with that thing, or what we should do with that thing. Gibson is a bit ambiguous on that. So he normally defines it in just by pointing out a number of examples, such as a surface that is knee-high and sufficiently steady affords sitting on. A roughly horizontal, flat, rigid, and sufficiently extended surface affords support. It is stand-onable. And the idea is that sometimes when we see object, we perceive what we can do with it, right? I look outside the window and I see a tree. Well, I don't actually see a tree from this window, but pretend that I do. And I don't only see its color or its shape, but I also see it as climbable, right? I see that I can climb on it. I watch a little stream and I see that I can jump on it, right? This would be the affordances. I see an apple, I see that it's edible. It tells me that I can eat it in some sense. So to make it slightly more abstract, we sometimes, and this is Ben Snane, we sometimes perceive action properties that concrete entities would allow us, even if we end up not perceiving or performing those actions. We see them as cueable for some action cue. I take it that at least sometimes we do have such affordances, right? I see my mug and I just see that I can lift it, right? It's not something that I have to infer reasoning, it just looks that way to me. And so the plan would be that if we were able to build our entire epistemology and modality upon the perception of such affordances, that would be very nice, because it would give us a nice, neat explanation of how we come to know mundane modal truths. Obviously, most likely we will not be able to squeeze out the entire epistemology of modality out of this perception. It seems very implausible that we will ever be able to find out whether time travel is possible just by looking at some things affordances, right? But importantly, we don't need to do that. We can develop a sort of two-step modal epistemology where perception of affordances give us a sort of entry point. They allow us to gather a number of sort of uncontroversial modal truths. And then we find a way to expand that initial set of beliefs using various kinds of reasoning. A good example here would be something like Williamsonian counterfactual thinking, right? Williamson thinks that we start off with knowledge of some counterfactuals, and then we just toy around with them using our offline reasoning abilities, and we end up knowing also sophisticated philosophical truths. So one possible way to go further from here is do something like that, only starting from the truth given us by perceptual affordances. I will not discuss this second step in the epistemology of modality, because what I'm really interested in is the first, so whether we can get any knowledge of modality from perception. But I'm happy to talk about it, right? It's unclear whether we can actually take that second step. Barbara Fetter has a nice paper on it, but it's very much in its infancy. Obviously, for this strategy to work, we need first to be a bit more clear than what I have been so far, though, on what affordances are, right? It's one thing to say, oh yeah, sure, we see that tree is climbable, but unless I tell you exactly what an affordance is, this will not get much purchase in the philosophical arena, right? And so here we come to the second leg of the setup. Apologies, the setup is a bit long for this talk, which is dispositionalism. That is, I think that an ontology of powers, or that is of irreducibly dispositional properties, is particularly well suited to match this epistemology. And a theory of modality that builds upon powers seem to fit perfectly well, seem to be the perfect candidate to fulfill the desiderata that our epistemology of modality has. To sort of, it seems like it has the good grounds to deliver the goods that we have. So let me say a couple of things very quickly on powers. If I'm being unclear on this, or if you find it puzzling, just stop me mid-tracks so we avoid chatting up for another hour without having the terms very clear. So powers are irreducibly dispositional properties. So they are the properties that confer or that ground our predication of disposition onto objects. So we can say that this mug is disposed to break if struck, and this disposition of it is given by an irreducibly dispositional property. That is, we cannot analyze away this disposition in terms of counterfactual or conditionals. I take this irreducibility as axiomatic, as it were, for the purposes of this talk. Obviously, if some of you are not convinced, we can talk about it. But for our purposes, I'll just take as a starting point that some dispositional properties cannot be reduced, and we should sort of take it as basic furniture of the world. Now, we call those powers, and powers are properties for some behavior, usually of their bearers, right? So when we say that the mug is fragile, what we mean is to say that the mug tends to be broken, or tends to be broken if stuck, if we want to put a stimuli on it. When we say that the salt is solvable, we mean that it tends to dissolve, or it's linked or directed towards being dissolved. Similarly, electrical charge, negative charge, you say, it is the tendency to bring about a certain force, according to Coulomb's law, repelling or attracting opposite or same charge entities. We call the entity that the power is for, what is directed for, the manifestation of the power. So the manifestation of fragility would be something like shattering or breaking. Right. So powers, irreducibly dispositional properties, are modal properties in two senses. They're irreducibly modal. In the first sense is that they are modally robust. That is, it is metaphysically impossible for fragility to be directed to something other than shattering. That is, when we look at how a system behaves or sort of evolves diachronically, what the system can do or cannot do, or how things will go, is dictated by the property that he has, and we normally think by the law of nature that apply to it, right? Now, under a standard sort of neo-Humean pictures, these two ingredients, the property that the system has and the dynamical laws that regulate its evolution, are sort of independent variable, right? We could retain the properties and the laws could be completely different. Not so for properties. If the mug is fragile, it will tend to break in every possible world. We cannot have different laws of nature. And this could either be because how a dynamical system evolves has nothing to do with the laws of nature, or because the laws of nature are grounded in powers, right? Both are perfectly available to a power ontology. And so they are modal properties in this sense, that they are more robust. A common way to cash out this robustness, which will become very important for the purpose of this talk, is to say that the normal robustness is because powers have their modal and causal profile essential to them. So what is the essence of a power? The essence of fragility. What fragility is pointing towards breaking, is tending toward breaking, right? We cannot understand what fragility is without making reference to breaking at any point. Whereas if we buy into categorical properties, we don't have to say that. This is also the reason why powers are an anti-Humean metaphysics, right? Because there are this sort of necessary connections between distinct existences. The second way in which powers are modal entities is because they have modal consequences. They can be truth makers for certain modal truths. The fact that my mug is fragile make it true that the mug could break, or at least this is the promise of the powers metaphysics, right? They are the truth makers of certain modal claims, and not only trivial ones, right? Everything trivially entails that. So every statement P trivially entails that possibly P, but powers are supposed to give us interesting modal truths. So the fact that the mug is fragile makes it true that the mug could break. And that, therefore, we learn something new, right, about modality. And this is what dispositionalism, this is what makes powers metaphysics so enticing for metaphysical purposes. Because one might think that given an ontology of powers, we can then explain and build out all the other modal phenomena out of them. So we can explain laws of nature, we can explain causation from them, and hopefully we can also explain modality, right? So this is a view that I like to call dispositionalism. And it's the view that the whole metaphysical modality is fully grounded in or explained by actual powers. So all the modal truths that we might care about, whether time travel is possible, whether there could be nothing rather than something, yada, 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 could all be grounded in just something being fragile, something being soluble, something having mass, and so on and so forth. This is roughly how you could state a very rough version of dispositionalism. It doesn't matter for our purposes, right? But it promises, so an ontology of powers promises to deliver us also a metaphysics of modality. And I think that prima facie, there is the union of the metaphysics of modality that results from adopting a powers ontology seem to sit extremely well with the sort of desiderata for an epistemology of modality that I sketched you before. They seem to be made, it seemed to fit right into the whole, right? It seemed to be perfectly plugged in. Why so? Well, because dispositionalism is allow us to ground model facts in the right kind of objects, to concrete objects that are actual, that I can come in epistemic contact with, that I can perceive, for instance. So to say that something is possible, I don't have to look at some other possible world that is not spatio-temporally connected with me, or that is an abstract entity or anything like that. I can just look at the mug and look at its fragility and thereby come to know that it can break. And in particular, they allow us to make a very tempting and I think quite natural hypothesis about what affordances are, the kind of affordances that Gibson was talking about. Namely, just say that, well, affordances just are powers. And we then can buy into a very naive theory of perception and say, and tell us a story about like this. Well, the tree has a dispositional property, that of being climbable. I perceive the property of the tree with my naive theory of perception, and thereby, and this is what the affordances is, me perceiving the dispositional property that the object has. The chair, I have the affordances that the apple is edible because the apple has that modal property, namely being edible. And so it looks like I can eat it because actually I'm truthfully, veridically perceiving one of its properties, one of its actual properties. And this makes me fairly hopeful about having a very simple sort of metaphysical cum epistemological picture of how we come to know modal truths, right? Because we can just say that, well, some properties are powers, and powers are the metaphysical grounds or the truth maker for modal truths or modal facts. And then we just happen to perceive those powers, right? They are just the properties that we touch, that we see, that we hear, and so on and so forth. And by doing so, we come to know the modal facts, right? By perceiving these powers, we thereby can come to know the modal truth that they ground. It is true that the mug can break. That is true in virtue of the fact that the mug has this property, this dispositional property is fragility. I just see fragility, and thereby I come to know that the mug could break. This is a very simple, very naive picture that I think I find very enticing, personally. It's important to note that there is a sort of transparency requirement here, that is, powers ground modal truths in virtue of their essential directness relations, right? In virtue of the fact that they tend toward their manifestation. This is a bit of annoying Aristotelian, sort of faux Aristotelian jargon, but the idea is that there are this necessary connection between a power and what it is for, its manifestation. And the reason why the power can be a truth maker for the modal statement is because it has this sort of modal relations with its manifestation. And so when we perceive these properties, we need to be able to access that bit of their essence. Otherwise, it would be completely opaque, right? consider the fact that I see a puddle of water in front of me. It is essential to the water that it's made of H2O, but I don't see a puddle of H2O in front of me. I don't see that the water is H2O necessarily, right? Because that is not transparent. So it's important that when I see the powers that give me the affordances, I am somehow able to take a peek at least of to their essence, to what they are for, right? This also hopefully will be important later on. And so having this metaphysics and this epistemology, and admittedly, both of these are extremely sketchy, right? I painted with a very broad paintbrush so far, but it promises to solve one of the most long-standing issues at the interface of metaphysics and epistemology of modality, namely the integration challenge. This is the challenge of reconciling a plausible account of what is involved in the truth of statement of a given kind with a credible account of how we can know those statements when we do know them, right? Integration challenges surface every time that we have a special class of truth about, say, mathematics or morality, where we seem to know stuff, but it's not really clear how do we know them, and the metaphysics makes it very mysterious, right? And I think that assuming dispositionalism and an empiricist perception-based epistemology of modality can really help us dealing with this problem. And I think this would be a great result. And note that this seems to meet all our desiderata, right? Obviously, it meets realism because powers are mind-independent. It meets a moderate anti-skepticism because presumably if the stuff that we come in contact with regularly, so mugs, cups, cars, and buses, have powers or have dispositional properties, then we perceive them. And then clearly it's anti-exceptionalist, right? Because it's based, at least initially, on perception. So everything is fine and dandy. So how we've just solved it, is this the end? This would be a great win for the kind of metaphysics that I like, right? Unfortunately, I think there are things are not so easy. So I painted quite a rosy picture, but I think there are some problems with this view. And before I continue and sort of present those worries that I have, is everything that I've said so far clear? Or if somebody wants some clarifications on the setup, this would be a good time to ask a super quick question. All good? Okay. So what's the problem then? Well, the problem is this. I have said that powers have this sort of modal robustness. Powers have their modal and causal profiles necessarily because they have it essentially, right? Having a certain direction, being directed towards a certain manifestation, is constitutive of the power property. It is part of what fragility is, that it is for breaking, right? Fragility wouldn't be the very property that it is if it weren't directed or tending towards breaking, right? If fragility were the property of, leading to burning, it just wouldn't be fragility, right? This is the whole spiel about powers, that they are robust in this way. This means that the identity of a power, and I mean here identity in a sort of thick sense of what it is to be that very entity, is at least partially fixed by what it is for, right? We have to look at what the manifestation is in order to understand what the power is, right? And this is very important because this is what makes powers to be credible truth makers for modal truths. Putting it in terms of essence, we can say that powers have a relational essence, right? Because when we slap an essence operator, which is just a subsentential operator that selects a particular subset of truth, we get a number of sentences, right, that reveal the real definition of an entity. So we ask, well, what is the nature, the real definition of this mug or of fragility? And what we get are sentences that mention something else, right? They mention breaking. Which is, again, the reason why powers are anti-Humean, why they have this sort of necessary connection between distinct existences. And there is nothing too problematic about having a relational essence, right? Prima facie. The complication comes when, well, I haven't, the problem comes now because we need to say a bit more about the metaphysics of powers, and then it will become very easy to see what goes wrong. So far we've treated powers to be this sort of directed entities that point at somebody beyond themselves. But so far we've treated fragility to be, on its own, a very happy, solid endpoint that, stays at its place and sort of reveals to us what fragility is. The trouble comes when you believe that all properties are powers, right? Because then also fragility will have a relational essence. So also also being broken or shattering or whatever will be a power. And thereby it will have to be defined. It will have its essence, its real definition will have to be given in terms of something else again, right? And thus we start risking at least to formulate a nice regress of identity, right? Well, what it is for something to be fragile? Oh, it is for it to be directed at being broken. And what it is for something to be broken? Oh, it's tending to cutting my feet when I step on it, or whatever is the dispositional characterization of being broken that we want to give, right? And so on ad infinitum, because we never reach a point whether something is not a power. Now, I think that power theorists have some good reason to be monist about powers, to think that all properties are powers, if they believe that at all. But the structure of this talk would be like this. I will first make a couple of very strong assumptions, including monism about powers, so thinking that every property is powers, to bring out the problem in its strongest terms. And then I'll show to you that even scaling back on some of those assumptions won't work to solve our problems, right? So now I'm going to give you a very extreme kind of overall metaphysics of powers, which I like quite a lot, but which makes a big problem for the epistemology of modality. And then I will argue that, well, even if we are a bit more moderate and a bit less insane, the problems remains. And so we're in a pretty bad spot. So the first thing, as I mentioned, is, well, what happens if all powers are, if all properties are powers? Don't we end up with a nice, nasty regress? And the answer is, well, not necessarily, no. The reason is that we can give a nice sort of structuralist theory of the identity of powers, right? If the network, the overall networks that powers are caught in, right? So the network formed by relationships about what points to what can give us precise identity conditions for powers, given that the overall graph has certain mathematical properties, right? If we represent the network of powers, so this network of relations between various properties in terms of a graph, as it happens, if the graph is asymmetric, that is, if it has no non-trivial automorphism, that is, if you cannot map it without changing anything apart from itself, right? If you cannot turn it around apart from itself without having some differences coming, then you can uniquely identify each point. This is very similar to what many people like to do in the case of, say, natural numbers. Say, well, what it is to be the number 2? Oh, it's just coming after, it's being the successor of number 1 and the number before number 3, right? And you say, well, but this clearly leads to a regress, right? Well, not necessarily, because if we can show that the overall structure has certain properties, we can uniquely identify these properties, right? And this is a picture of powers that I like to call power structuralism. And I find the view very appealing. I think that the other options are not very viable. We can talk about why. I will not bore you with those. Let's just say that it's a fairly orthodox position in the literature. But now we finally are ready to see what the problem is for the epistemology of modality, right? What goes wrong? And what goes wrong is that now the essence, so what it is to be a single one of these points, right? What it is to be this guy right here, can only be explained if I know the overall structure that is caught in, right? Because the way in which I identified this particular dot on the graph is to say, well, it's the only dot that is connected to the only dot that has two connections or something like that, right? But obviously I cannot do that unless I know everything about the structure, right? And this is going to be an enormously complex structure. So bear in mind that here we're talking about natural properties. And so I can only know what fragility is if I know the overall network of properties and relation that fragility stands with respect to everything else, right? And it's a plausible assumption. I can give you a cute little argument later if you're interested, to think that if there is a network of powers, then it must encompass every physical property that there is. All the physical property must be within the same network. And this is clearly going to be an enormously complex kind of structure, right? But then this raises the question about our little epistemology of modality that was all based on knowing what properties are by perceiving them. Namely that, well, if I can only get to know modal truth by perceiving properties, but knowing what I'm perceiving requires me to know literally every fact about the overall structure of physical properties, right? I need a complete science in order to do that, because otherwise I'm not able to metaphysically individuate my property. Then this seems to put a preposterous task upon my perceptual abilities, right? I would be able to read off the structure of the whole universe just by looking at my mug. And this is crazy, right? This is clearly something that we cannot do. So power structuralism has it that all the essences of powers are incredibly complex and they're all related. And yet we're supposed to believe that we can just come to know them by perceiving them. And this is bonkers, right? So this is the first issue, is that it just doesn't seem the kind of thing that we can know by perception. Maybe let's allow it that it is even feasible for us to know to have a complete science, right? Let's assume that eventually collectively we'll get to a complete picture of science, or we'll complete physics or whatever. But surely we cannot do that by looking at a mug, right? It will take us much more significant efforts, to the dismay of all the funding bodies. And the second worry here is that this really makes a big problem for our moderate anti-skeptical requirement. That is, it seems to us that it points us to a very unlovely dilemma. That is, either we know absolutely every modal truth because we have access to the overall structure of powers, and therefore we can know all the truths that are grounded by such structure, namely all modal truths, if the metaphysics of powers that I have sketched to you is the correct one. Or do we not know any truth at all, right? And clearly we don't know everything. Therefore, we have to conclude that we don't know any modal truth. And therefore we fail one of our desiderata. We end up in a radical skeptical scenario about modality. And this is bad. To make this problem a bit more concrete, consider this mug, right? And which has a dispositional property, that is, it's breakable, right? So what is essential about the property of being breakable is that it is directed at breaking, right? It is for breaking, and so on. In the view that I'm designing, breaking is also for something else, yada, 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 ad infinitum, right? And it is the very fact that it is breakable, and therefore that it points toward breaking, that the fragility of this mug grounds the truth of, oh, this mug could break, or this mug would break if I hit it with a hammer or whatever. But then it's very important for me that I know that it has the property B, right? It has the property breakable in order for me to know the modal truth. Because it is not obvious at all that if the mug had some other property, B star, right? That other property could ground the same truth, right? If this mug, instead of being fragile, it's schmackable, are we so sure that the property schmackable also is a truth maker for the mug can break? It's hard to tell, right? But that would put a considerable strain on our epistemology, because it's all based on the fact that I see the mug, and I thereby come to know that it can break. But in order to do so, I need to know that this mug is fragile, right? I need to be able to perceive its fragility and not something else. Okay, and so it seems that the lovely picture that, at least the picture that I found very appealing in the beginning, turns out to be somewhat nightmarish, right? It promised to be this natural, fantastic union that delivered exactly what we were hoping for. And we ended up in a complete modal skepticism, the worst possible result ever, right? Don't worry, I'm almost done. So you might think that, well, maybe we can fix this, right? You've given us a very extreme sort of metaphysics of powers, right? This sort of full structuralist view of what powers are. Surely you're not helping yourself there, right? You've given the worst possible candidate. Maybe if we scale back on some of those requirements, for instance, we stop believing that every property is a power, then surely you will make your life easier, right? Unfortunately, I don't think it's that easy to solve this problem. So I'll run very quickly through this. I will not give you much details on these solutions, but I would be very happy to talk more about them because I would really like one of these to work. So if you think that you can fix this, I'd highly appreciate. So the first natural thought is this. Well, the problem with your account is pure power structuralism, right? The idea that all there is to the identity of a power is its place in the overall network. If we thought that there is more to the identity and essence of a power than its place in the structure, then surely the worries would, if not evaporate, at least become more manageable, right? And here we have two strategies that we can invoke. One is thinking that the essence or the identity of a particular power is not uniquely, is not solely determined, is not exhausted by its place in the structure. Surely the place in the structure, so the fact that the mug tends, that the fragility tends to this other property, does something to fix its identity. But there is also something else, right? Maybe there is also a quality that is intrinsic to fragility. Maybe fragility has a sort of more self-contained aspect, right? It has a color, as it were. It's not only little arrows and sort of this very abstract picture that you've painted, but it has also a bit more substance, it has a quality as well, right? So this is one way. The other way is to reject monism about power and say, well, surely issues are not that bad if you think that there are powers, but there are also non-powers, right? There are also categorical properties that powers point to. So maybe fragility points toward breaking, but breaking in turn doesn't point about anything. Breaking is just there. It has a primitive identity, as it were. It's a non-relational identity. Then maybe things are fine, right? We can solve the problem there. Okay, I don't think that any of these works. So I'll skip over powerful qualities because I think that the view is nonsensical to begin with, but we can talk about it later if you want. And I'll just go to the mixed view option, which I think is what a lot of you would find intuitively compelling. And also because I think that this view theoretically could work. So the idea would be this. Well, not all properties are powers. Some are just categorical quiddities. So they have a primitive non-relational essence. What it is to be broken has nothing to do with how that behaves. It's just something that it's there, right? It has its identity is primitive. It's given. It doesn't need anything else. But if we, as it were, they are dead ends in the network that I've pictured, right? In the big structural network, there are some points that they don't have any arrows out. And this point I can individuate alone. And if I can do that, then maybe I can work my way backwards, right? So maybe I can get to know what it is to be broken without having to know anything else about the universe. It's just something that it's given to me primitively. And fragility just is the power that points to that. So maybe I can get to know everything I need to know, right? I look, maybe that's something that I can take in perception. Maybe the essence of fragility is something that is available to me because there is only one step removed for something that is self-contained. And if by looking at the mug, I can also get a sense of what it would be for it to be broken. And that in turn, that's the end, that's where the buck stops, right? That's the end of where my understanding needs to go. Then surely I've understood what fragility is, right? What's the big deal? I think that generally this could work. The only problem is that the only candidates for being categorical properties that a power theorist, I think, could accept do not seem up to the task. So the candidates of being these categorical properties that do not have relational essences, I don't think that they are up for the job of sort of grounding the epistemology of modality that we want. So there are three candidates in the literature that sort of people are on the fence about, that seem plausible for somebody who already buys into powers. Let's make that clear, that they could possibly conceive to be known powers in turn. The first is sort of spatiotemporal points or locational properties, such as being located at spatiotemporal points x, y, z, t in the space-time manifold, right? It seems very hard to give a dispositional definition of that sort of property, and so you might think, well, maybe being located at some point is not in turn a power. Another option is to go with mathematical geometrical properties. Being a circle just is having all one's points equidistant from the center, or being correctly described by the little formula 2 pi per range, or whatever the formula to calculate the area or the surface of the circle is, right? And these don't seem to be well described by powers. The third option would be qualia, or phenomenal properties, right? What it feels like to be in pain, well, that just doesn't seem a dispositional properties, right? It's just a quality, how it feels. We can't gloss it in terms of powers. The fact is that I don't think that we can build the truth of, oh, if I throw my football at the window, surely it will break, out of if these are the only dead ends in our structure, right? Even assuming that we can reduce something like the window breaking to qualia or spatiotemporal points or mathematical or geometrical properties and sort of get there eventually, they seem to be incredibly complex sort of construct, right? Try to explain what it is for a window to break or for me to miss my train in these terms. It's surely an incredibly long and complex sentence, etc., etc. Or in other terms, even if we Ramsify the whole structure, right? We give the Ramsified book of laws and we give a functional description, but we don't Ramsify it fully. So we take some terms in there before we get to learn what it is to lift a mug or something like that in those terms. Those seem just to be too complex things. So it's not very plausible, I think, that we're just 1 or 2 steps removed from understanding what is going on. The final option would be to weaken transparency, to say, well, you're making a big fuss about nothing really, because all of your problems hangs on the requirement, that it's a stupidly strong requirement, that in order to know a modal truth, you need to know the identity of its truth maker, right? You need to know that it's made true by this property and nothing else, right? The fact that the mug can break has to be made true by fragility, which is just this property. But surely one might think, sentences can have all sorts of truth makers, right? I don't need to know exactly which one it is that is doing the job. The fact that the mug can break is true, can be made true by all sorts of properties. So yeah, maybe the one that is actually in front of me is fragility, but it would be good also if it was some other property that is not fragility, but just resembles it, right? That's fine. So you might think that as long as we have a good grasp of the structure immediately surrounding the property we are perceiving, we are warranted in believing some modal truth, because even if we don't know that this property that is in front of me is exactly fragility, well, it's something that resembles it a bit, at least locally, right? The problem is that the solution hangs on a thesis along these lines, which I think is hopelessly weak. So this sort of account could work only if the following is true. For all powers, A and B, if A surrounding structure is similar enough to B surrounding structure, then A and B make the same modal claims true, roughly. And the problem is that this introduces an unbelievable amount of vagueness into a problem. And I think it's very open to counterexample, especially when we're talking about functional properties. We know that if something has a functional properties and we embed it in another system, it might not have that functional property anymore. So I'm very pessimistic about the chances of sort of making this strategy work and say, well, maybe something that just resembles it can do the same truth-making work. So what then? I sketched you a vision or sort of an epistemology of modality and a metaphysics of modality that I thought would work very well in tandem, but it turns out that they don't really. So we have two options here, right? We can either say, well, okay, it was not the right epistemology of modality. It was just stupid of you to hope that you could get knowledge of what is possible, what is necessary out of perception. Why would you be so special, right? And that's surely, we can do that. There are plenty of others epistemologies of modality out there, and surely powers can try to do something else, right? We can go back to conceivability or back to counterfactual reasoning like Williamson, and so on and so forth. Obviously, dispositions would lose a bit as a metaphysical doctrine, would lose a bit of its allure by not being able to deliver this especially desirable epistemology, but it could survive. Or the other option is to change the metaphysics itself, right? So what was creating problems to us was this idea that powers have these relational essences, right? That the identity of powers was dictated by what they were related to, related with. That was what generated the problem. So if we could get rid of that assumption, maybe we could retain this lovely solution to the integration problem. And the issue is that, somewhat surprisingly, I think that this is the route that I find myself more inclined towards. This is what I'm starting to think that we should do. Maybe there is some problem with this core assumption of powers as relational entities. The problem is that I have no clue yet of how to proceed without this assumption, because it is through this assumption that we were able in the first place to distinguish powers from non-powers. And in general, a lot of the metaphysics of powers builds and relies on this assumption. And so I think that if we want to retain this lovely marriage between the empiricist epistemology of modality and powers metaphysics, we would have to deeply rethink our metaphysics of powers in a way that I'm not quite sure yet about how to do. Okay, sorry for going on so long, and thanks for bearing with me. I'm looking forward to your question. Thank you.